In this episode, we are moving from the idea of checking security at certain moments to the idea of watching security continuously over time, which is where monitoring becomes so important. Security monitoring tools and techniques help an organization notice suspicious activity, recognize control failures, and respond before a problem grows into a crisis that affects the business. For someone studying for the CISA Certified Information Systems Auditor (CISA) certification, this topic matters because an auditor is often asked to evaluate whether monitoring is timely, meaningful, and connected to real risk rather than just producing noise. For a beginner, the most useful starting point is understanding that monitoring is not the same thing as simply collecting technical data, because the real goal is to turn ongoing activity into awareness, and then turn that awareness into action before confidentiality, integrity, or availability is seriously harmed. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. At a basic level, security monitoring means observing systems, networks, applications, accounts, and devices so an organization can detect unusual, unauthorized, or harmful behavior. A company cannot defend what it never notices, and that is why monitoring sits at the center of modern security operations. Preventive controls such as access restrictions, segmentation, and patching still matter, but they do not guarantee that every attack will be stopped at the first attempt. Monitoring exists because organizations must assume that some failures, mistakes, or intrusions will still occur, and they need a way to see those events quickly enough to respond. This makes monitoring both a technical and a business function, because a delay in detection can mean longer attacker access, wider damage, larger recovery costs, and more uncertainty for leaders trying to make decisions under pressure. One helpful way to understand monitoring is to separate raw data from useful information. Systems constantly generate records about logins, file access, network traffic, administrative changes, process execution, and application behavior, but raw records by themselves do not create security value. They only become useful when the organization knows what to collect, how long to keep it, how to relate one event to another, and what kind of behavior should trigger deeper review. That is why monitoring depends on both tools and techniques. A tool may gather logs or display alerts, but the technique is what determines whether the right signals are being captured, whether they are being interpreted correctly, and whether staff know how to act on them when the activity looks dangerous instead of routine. Logs are one of the foundational building blocks of monitoring because they provide a record of what systems and users have been doing over time. A log may show when someone signed in, when a privileged command was executed, when a configuration changed, when data moved, or when a service failed in an unusual way. These records matter because security incidents are rarely understood through one event alone. The real meaning often appears only when multiple events are viewed together across time, systems, and identities. For that reason, organizations that take monitoring seriously work to collect logs from many important sources, preserve their integrity, and make them available for analysis. From an audit perspective, the existence of logs is not enough, because the more important question is whether the right events are logged consistently and whether the organization can rely on those records during detection, investigation, and reporting. As monitoring programs mature, they often rely on centralized platforms to bring together events from many parts of the environment. A common example is a Security Information and Event Management (SIEM) system, which helps aggregate, organize, correlate, and review event data from different sources. The value of a SIEM is not that it magically solves security problems, but that it helps analysts see patterns that would be difficult to notice if logs stayed isolated inside individual servers, applications, and devices. When a user signs in from an unusual location, accesses sensitive data, and then triggers a privileged action on another system, those connected events may matter far more together than they do separately. For beginners, the important lesson is that centralized monitoring improves visibility, but it only works well when the organization has chosen useful data sources, written sensible rules, and built processes for reviewing what the system surfaces. Monitoring tools are often grouped by what they observe, and that makes it easier to understand their role. Network monitoring tools watch traffic patterns, connection attempts, data flows, and communication behavior between systems. Endpoint monitoring tools focus on laptops, servers, workstations, and other devices where code runs and users interact directly with resources. Application monitoring tools look at how software behaves, including failed access attempts, unusual transactions, service errors, and suspicious use of sensitive functions. Identity monitoring pays attention to accounts, authentication events, privilege changes, and access behavior across users and administrators. Each of these views matters because attacks do not move through an organization in one simple line, and the organization needs visibility into the different places where suspicious activity may leave evidence before it becomes obvious to everyone. Network monitoring is especially important because networks connect the parts of the environment that attackers often try to move through after gaining initial access. Tools in this area may help identify scanning, unexpected connections, unusual data transfers, communication with suspicious external locations, or traffic between systems that should rarely interact. This matters because an attacker who enters through one weak point often still needs to explore the network, find valuable assets, and move laterally before reaching a real objective. Good network monitoring can therefore reveal behavior that suggests reconnaissance, command activity, data staging, or attempts to bypass segmentation. For a CISA candidate, the larger idea is that networks provide important evidence about control effectiveness, because monitoring can show whether boundaries are being respected in practice or whether traffic patterns reveal weaknesses in architecture, oversight, or enforcement. Endpoint monitoring matters just as much because many security events become visible first on the actual device where a user signs in, where a process starts, or where a file is changed. Tools in this space often look for suspicious processes, unusual privilege use, unexpected persistence behavior, file modifications, or signs that an attacker is using trusted administrative tools in an abnormal way. A widely discussed capability here is endpoint detection and response, EDR, which helps organizations observe and investigate activity directly on endpoints while supporting response actions when needed. The strength of EDR is that it provides context close to where the activity occurs, which can help analysts understand whether an event is harmless, mistaken, or clearly malicious. For beginners, the central point is that endpoints are not just passive machines in the environment, because they are often the place where human behavior, software behavior, and attacker behavior come together most clearly. Another major part of monitoring involves intrusion-focused tools that are designed to notice patterns associated with hostile activity. An intrusion detection system, IDS, is built to identify suspicious traffic or behavior and generate alerts for review, while an intrusion prevention system, IPS, goes a step further by attempting to block or stop certain activity automatically. These tools can be very useful, but they also show why monitoring and detection are not identical to certainty. An alert may point to genuine danger, but it can also reflect a harmless pattern that happens to resemble something risky, which is why tuning and context matter so much. This area teaches an important beginner lesson. Good monitoring does not mean every alert is an emergency, and effective organizations succeed by improving signal quality so that analysts can distinguish true problems from normal variation without becoming overwhelmed by constant false alarms. Identity and access monitoring deserves special attention because so many incidents involve the misuse of valid accounts rather than the obvious use of obviously malicious code. When an attacker steals credentials or abuses over-permissioned accounts, the activity may appear legitimate on the surface because the system recognizes the identity as authorized. Monitoring, therefore, has to look beyond whether access was technically allowed and ask whether the behavior fits the normal pattern for that user, that role, that location, and that time. If an employee who normally signs in from one city during working hours suddenly accesses sensitive records late at night from another region, that change may be more meaningful than the sign-in itself. From an audit standpoint, identity monitoring helps show whether the organization is capable of detecting account misuse, privilege abuse, and failed access governance before those issues lead to material business impact. As environments become larger and more complex, Organizations also rely more heavily on behavioral techniques rather than only fixed rules. User and Entity Behavior Analytics, UEBA, is one example of this approach because it focuses on identifying deviations from expected patterns across users, devices, and systems. Instead of relying only on a known signature or a simple threshold, behavior-based monitoring asks whether something looks materially different from what is normal in that environment. This can help identify threats that do not match older detection patterns, including insider misuse, stealthy lateral movement, or slow data theft conducted over time. At the same time, behavioral monitoring is not perfect, because unusual does not always mean malicious, and some truly harmful activity may still appear normal enough to escape notice at first. That is why experienced organizations combine behavior analysis with log review, asset context, threat intelligence, and human judgment. Monitoring techniques also depend heavily on baselines, correlation, and prioritization. A baseline is the organization's working picture of normal activity, such as regular login times, common network paths, expected service behavior, and ordinary rates of change for certain systems. Correlation means connecting events from different sources so that separate signals can be understood as part of one developing pattern. Prioritization means deciding which alerts deserve immediate attention and which can be reviewed later without creating unacceptable risk. These techniques matter because most organizations generate far more activity than any team could review manually. And without structure, the monitoring function quickly drowns in its own data. For CISA learners, this reinforces a broader assurance principle. Controls are not effective merely because they exist, but because they operate in a way that supports timely, risk-based decisions instead of creating confusion or unmanaged backlog. A strong monitoring capability also depends on the people and processes around the technology. Even the best tools produce limited value if nobody knows who owns alert review, how incidents are escalated, how evidence is preserved, or when leaders need to be informed. Many organizations support monitoring through a Security Operations Center, SOC, where analysts review events, investigate suspicious activity, and coordinate with other teams when response actions are needed. Whether the function is fully internal, shared, or outsourced, the underlying challenge remains the same. The organization must turn signals into decisions with enough speed and discipline to reduce harm. This is one reason auditors often look beyond product deployment and ask how monitoring responsibilities are assigned, whether staff are trained, whether coverage exists outside normal business hours, and whether repeated lessons actually improve future detection. Metrics matter here as well, but they must be chosen carefully or they can create a false sense of strength. Organizations often track volume-based numbers such as alert counts, but those figures alone do not say much about monitoring quality. More useful measures may include how long it takes to detect suspicious activity, how long it takes to investigate, how often alerts are closed as false positives, and whether recurring issues show that detection rules or escalation practices need improvement. Some teams also watch key performance indicators, KPIs, and key risk indicators, KRIS, to understand both operational efficiency and growing exposure. For a beginner, the lesson is that monitoring should not be judged by how busy the dashboard looks, but by whether the organization is seeing the right things quickly enough and learning from what the data reveals over time. When all of these ideas come together, security monitoring tools and techniques begin to look less like a collection of technical products and more like a living awareness system for the organization. Monitoring gathers evidence from networks, endpoints, applications, and identities, then uses correlation, baselines, behavior analysis, and human review to determine what deserves action. Some tools focus on visibility, some on alerting, and some on response support, but all of them are only as effective as the governance, tuning, staffing, and follow-through around them. For someone preparing for CISA, the most important takeaway is that monitoring is not about watching everything equally or generating endless alerts. It is about building the ability to notice meaningful changes in risk, understand what those changes mean, and respond before isolated events become larger failures that threaten the organization's operations, trust, and resilience.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.